Welcome to SALTovation. The SALTovation Show is a podcast series featuring the leading voices in SALT, where we talk about the issues and strategies to help you make sense of state and local tax. Welcome to another SALTovation discussion. Today we are joined by Michelle Bush, a partner at Silverstein Pomerantz law firm. Michelle began her tax practice with the Tax and Revenue Division of the Utah Attorney General's Office, where she handled individual income tax, sales and use tax, and property tax matters on behalf of the Utah State Tax Commission. After becoming the property tax section chief for that office, she litigated state-assessed property tax matters involving public utilities, telecommunications, airlines, railroads, pipelines, and mining properties. Michelle moved to Colorado and served as an assistant city attorney with the city and county of Denver. During her tenure, she has litigated numerous local taxation and bankruptcy matters before administrative hearing officers and in Colorado courts. We are lucky to have Michelle join us today to give us her insight, especially from the perspective of someone who challenges tax law within the court system. Michelle, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here.
And as always, SALTovation's Judy Vorndran.
Hello, everyone.
Michelle, I gave an incredibly high summary of your background, but walk us through the progression of your career.
Yeah, you bet. So, I graduated from law school in 1992, which it sounds longer ago than it feels. And at the time, I was law clerking for the Utah Attorney General's office, and they had an opening in their tax division. So, it's not like I set out to become a tax attorney, but that was the job, that I was able to get. And so I've been doing SALT since I was a brand new baby lawyer. Started off doing really low level stuff, individual income tax. They put, always the lowest person on the totem pole. You get put with the tax protesters. So I got to deal with a lot of the folks who think that, they don't have to pay income taxes because there's fringe on the flag and things like that. So worked my way up there doing sales and use, a little bit of corporate franchise tax, individual income tax, then eventually moving to the really large state assessed property tax group. So, that's huge litigation. You're talking about properties that cross state and county lines. Their values are in the billions of dollars. So that was my primary focus starting in about 1999. And then I did that. I had a brief stint at Salt Lake County for about a year. I moved from the Utah AG's office to go to the Salt Lake District Attorney's office to do exclusively property tax. And that was supposed to be a long-term career move, but then things changed and our family decided to move to Colorado. So, I negotiated a year off to be with my kids who were young at the time, 3 and 5. And then after my daughter said, "Mom, when can we go back to daycare?" It's time to start looking for a job. And magically, Denver had an opening, and the job listing said we're searching for someone with 10 to 15 years of state and local tax litigation experience in all of these areas, sales and use, property. Like, they're looking for me. I mean, there really aren't, this, Judy, there aren't a lot of us. So applied for that job, was fortunate enough to get it, and spent 5 years with Denver doing locally assessed property taxes and sales and use tax and learning about Colorado's home rule city environment because Utah doesn't have that. So that was a whole new, wow. I mean, that's
a word for Colorado's, taxing system.
I think that's the technical term for it. Yeah. It's definitely, it's hard to comply with all of the home rule cities and their different interpretations and that. So, I spent 5 years with Denver and learned a lot and worked with a lot of great people, represented the Treasury Division there. And it just turns out I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to join Neil Pomerantz and Mark Medina at Silverstein Pomerantz in the Denver office. So been there since 2012. And I think that's, if I have my way, that's where I'll die. So it's a great practice. And I'm glad I made the change.
So does that mean you cross sides representing the city and then now representing taxpayers?
Exactly. Just doing the exact same stuff, switching sides as Neil. Some people that I used to work with say I've gone to the dark side.
Yes.
Neil says he rescued me from the dark side. So I suppose it's a matter of perspective.
Are you allowed to say which one you prefer more?
I think every time wherever I worked, it was the right thing at the time. When I was just starting out, I was also in the Army National Guard. And so I chose public practice because I didn't really foresee that I could do military service in a reserve capacity and be in private practice. And I also had a young family, so that was just the right thing. Um, Now it's the right thing for me to be in private practice. I can leverage my experience, and my relationships and my knowledge, um, to do even a more broadly challenging practice. So is that a good way of avoiding an answer to your question?
Yeah. It's as if you haven't been listening to all the political stuff going on where no answers are given whatsoever. You don't have to clarify.
Well, if Neil is listening, then I prefer what I'm doing now.
Yes, the lifelong commitment needs to say, I prefer the business
Yes,
side.
exactly. Yeah. No, it's been an excellent move, and I'm glad I made it.
Wasn't it just overwhelming coming here though from Utah? I mean, I feel like Utah has its complexities, but a heck of a lot simpler than 71 home rule cities, one state, 683 statutory cities. I mean, we for such a small state, we have such a complicated state tax system. And you wonder why. Like, why were we like this? I mean, and then I was say, I think we were talking earlier where Denver, the population is probably equivalent to the population of Utah. I mean, I'm going to Google it right now. I haven't done it yet, but I think it's almost the same amount of humans. So even though you represent an entire state, Denver is a very large metropolitan area. So really, it's a very different mentality in sort of the city versus state, but similar population issues. So a lot of work, honestly, and a lot of nuance and a lot of businesses. And, you've got your metro area in Utah, Salt Lake City and Provo and some of that. And then you've got your outlying areas with your recreational areas, ski areas, and so forth. So you kind of have a little bit of the same of what we have here, honestly, metro area schools, and then you've got your skis and your fishing and all the different things that Colorado provides to its citizenry and visitors. So similar
Right.
issues, but we have such a crazy system. Did you
No
comment?
doubt about it.
Oh my gosh, what is wrong with us?
Well, when I first got here and somebody said, "Oh yeah, you got to figure out uh, the home rule cities," and I nodded my head like, "Yeah, I got to do that." And then I'm thinking, "What the heck is that?" So I think I had to Google it even to figure out what that meant, because that was a whole new thing. It's definitely, um, and that is one of the main reasons I'm really glad I spent 5 years with Denver.
Oh
I don't
yeah.
think you can grasp the home rule environment unless you work in it
Mhm.
or work with it. I mean,
Correct.
and even then, there are still things I have to say. Does Denver's code say that? Even though I worked there and looked at this code
Yes.
and read it
Yes.
all the time, I have to keep looking at it, and there's just so many moving parts, and so even if Denver has the same code, a neighboring city has the exact same code, but for whatever reason they interpret it and apply it differently. So then you
Yes.
have those. Yeah, yeah,
Well, and then business is morphing all the time, right? And it's not keeping
yeah.
up. So, like, I'm just curious, and in lieu of those two experiences, like in terms of enforcement, right? You were working on behalf of enforcement in both jurisdictions, and now you're working on behalf of like valid enforcement. I would argue,
Mhm.
like, don't
Right,
overreach, right? Like, you wouldn't
right,
have a case if you didn't think the government was overreaching, to my mind. If people were good with the assessments, they would pay them, right? They don't hire an attorney if they feel comfortable with what the decision is, and they're not comfortable with the decision. So what framework do you bring with regards to that, giving your position as a government administrator and say these are valid? Now you're saying, wait a minute, there's some overreaching here. Where is your thoughts on that?
right. Right. Well, and first, I think what you're saying is the taxpayers who make challenges to things that are overreaches. I think that's even a small percentage of the actual overreach,
Okay.
because you have a small company that gets a very small assessment. It's certainly, they have to make a business decision. Are you going to pay somebody $30,000 to fight a $20,000 assessment?
Yep.
And that's just an example. And so there's a lot of overreach, I think, that happens that just never gets called on.
Yep.
The cities become emboldened by that. So
Okay.
we hear all the time, we've always imposed this tax. Nobody's ever challenged it. I heard that when I was with Denver.
Okay.
Nobody ever challenges this. And then you start looking, well, just because nobody's challenging it doesn't mean it's the right application. Doesn't mean it's the wrong application.
Correct. Correct.
But, longstanding practice is what the cities love to say, well, this is what we've been always doing. Well, let's look at your code and see what your code permits you to do. So, from the client perspective, there are situations where the client feels like it's an overreach, and we have to tell them, in this case, it's not. The city got it right this time. And we do that when it makes sense. But yeah, I mean, if you're it's a balancing act, right? The cities are, and I genuinely, having worked with auditors at Denver and Utah, most of the auditors that we encountered, they're just trying to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
They have been told what their code means. They've they've got an understanding, and our clients are trying to do the right things. I think it's a really, really rare case where you have either an auditor who's blatantly trying to push things that they think are beyond the scope of their code, or a taxpayer that is absolutely a scofflaw. I mean, but it's a balancing act. You got to figure out where that line is, and I think that's the constant tension, because the economy is always evolving. Products are always
Yes.
evolving. The way people do business is evolving. But in Colorado, because of Tabor, the codes don't get to evolve.
Yeah.
So you got to lock yourself into this 1992, 1991 environment. And can that code have predicted the new services, the new economy, the new kinds of products that are rolling out? And so the cities have to be creative, if you will, to try and figure out how they administer these. Doesn't sound like an older code, but there's a lot that's different from
And it's very
1992.
hard to make laws, as we all
Yeah.
know. I mean, it's
Yeah.
a time-consuming, years-long process. It doesn't just happen overnight if it's put together thoughtfully.
Well, and especially when you have to push things out because of Tabor, to a vote of the people. I live in Denver, so I vote, on Denver measures. Reading, I get my blue book for the state, I get my blue book for Denver, and I'm reading kind of the ballot initiatives. It's like, I have no idea what this means. So like things
Right.
aren't
Yes.
written such that the constituents can really understand what they're
Yeah.
what they're trying to vote for, that is
Yeah.
really at the best interest of the state or the city or the whatever.
Right.
Right.
That is
No,
so
even
true. Yeah.
even as a tax practitioner, I had to read the blue book on the Gallagher Amendment thing
Mhm.
multiple times. And
Yes.
I'm still not sure, that
The
I
words
understand
are
it.
what they are meant to say. No, I could not agree more. I'm reading the language of this ordinance and the state or whatever, the language, and I'm thinking, what are you really saying? And then I read the pros and the cons, and I'm like, okay, I guess this is a pragmatic application on this side versus this side. And even that wasn't that clear to me. And this is a
Right.
whole issue we have now on whether or not to allow our residential property taxes to increase, which has
Right.
been something that's been falsely kept low for many years to our benefit. As I look at property taxes around the nation, Colorado has some of the lowest.
Right.
Yeah, so very interesting issue. And I'm not a big fan of property taxes going up with fair market value personally, because people pay a certain price when they buy, and that's kind of
Right.
what they expect. And so why should they have this false inflation being in their tax base when it's not even a known thing, right? And it could dip and
Right.
go up and down. But I'm going to live in my home till I die, maybe. And now I've got these taxes that are going up and up and up. So
Right.
that troubles me, to be honest, as a taxpayer. So
Right. But I think if you even look at the blue book on the initiative that's on the ballot now, the Gallagher Amendment initiative, I think even if you can understand what the initiative says, it's not clear what it means or what it's going to do.
Mhm.
It's not clear to voters. If I vote yes, what does this mean for me? And what does this mean for the business down the street? I think that, and I'm not sure we even know,
yeah,
what the
I couldn't
answer
agree
is to
more.
that. Yeah.
Michelle, I know, there's this process within Colorado of trying to simplify everything from a sales tax perspective, the SUTS system, one point of central registration, central remittance. But we've heard kind of on like multiple levels that the cities really didn't, and maybe this is evolving, the cities didn't trust the state to collect the money that they're due. And that, there was just this tension of relinquishing control to someone else. Did you find that when you were working at the city?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the cities, with their home rule thinking, necessarily have, this idea that we got to do this, especially a big city who is not just self collecting, but they're not even farming that out. They have their own collection group. I mean, Denver's very large, and some of the
Mhm.
cities are small enough that they can't do that. So I think maybe the thought process would be different from a city like Denver or Aurora, some city that's large enough that has their staff. So I wouldn't say I felt like there was distrust between the cities and the state so much as the desire to retain control and have your fingers on everything. I mean, honestly, I think it would be hard to say that the state isn't to be trusted to collect the money and to divvy it out, especially if the cities have an ability to review the records, and certainly they do, or they should. But no, I never felt like there was a high level of distrust between Denver and the state, and I don't sense that now, at least.
That's
Correct
good.
me if I'm wrong, Judy, if
I
you
think
hear
there's
that,
more
but
on the
no.
I perceive it to be in the counties and the outlying areas. Yeah, there was a lot of feedback during the discourse around the SUT system about you're not going to get the right people in the jurisdiction. You don't know where we are. And then some of the cities don't even have good meets and bounds, right? It's all paper. They don't even have a good system of record of knowing who's where. And we got some comfort around that because we bought a third party, the state bought a third party system called TTRES that actually went in and rooftop rated everybody. I mean, they cites everything, spent tons of man hours spatially figuring out where everything is so they could accurately reflect the jurisdictional boundaries of a rate. So, State County is an amoeba or a parallelogram or whatever the heck the shape is that fits over the overlay of the city. And then you've got the RTD. So just all those go into different cities and counties and all that. So there was a lot of fear, I think, outside of Denver about where they were, but that was partly related to bad technology, to be honest, or lack of technology, honestly, and resources to really accurately measure where people are. And these are remote areas with maybe 5,000 people in them. I mean, good group. How are you going to How are you going to justify spending the cost to figure out where things are? I mean, to some degree,
Right.
it's
When
just
I
But the state's already collecting for all the statutory cities and counties. So the state's already doing that. And
correct.
some of those are in outlying areas. So yeah, once you get the boundaries figured out and then you can have a system you can trust for sourcing, then yeah.
Yeah, I remember my internship, like the first summer I worked in public accounting, because I walked right into public accounting doing state and local tax. So I'm one of kind of like the weird outliers. Um, but I remember our, sales tax guy pulls out these maps. And I was like, what the hell are you doing? Like, I thought we were like tax people and like our nose was in some sort of book, but like this whole map thing. And he's like, all right, well, this is Alamosa County, and this is actually this. And it was all like highlighted and written all over. I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, I don't know if I'm signing up for this.
Well, and talk to a company that's doing business in all of those places. Have you ever looked at the boundaries of North Glen versus Thornton, for example? I mean, good luck trying to figure out you've got an address on one side of the street that's in a city, an address on the other side of the street, and even taxpayers that are trying to get it right, it's a challenge.
Yeah. And then they get in trouble on audits and I mean, it's kind of incumbent on them to know. And it's sort of like, that's sort of ridiculous thing to do. I mean, you can't even do it based on zip code. You can't do it on name and address information because you could say it's in Denver, but it's in North Glen from a tax perspective. I'm like, how are people supposed to know that? It's just craziness.
Right. Well, because a lot of mailing addresses that are actually in Glendale have a Denver, they say Denver,
Yep.
because Glendale's a little donut hole in Denver. And so, yeah, you got to really want to get it right.
And did you ever get any history as to why it was like that? How does it get done when you're building something that it becomes this different pie shape, whatever shape amoeba that covers one thing versus another? Well, how does that happen from a building perspective? Why don't we have
Yeah,
clearer lines?
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know.
I live on Sheridan, and apparently like right down the middle of Sheridan is Wheat Ridge, and then I'm Denver. I mean, it's that close to where I live.
Wow.
I learned that the hard way because we were driving north on Sheridan
Mhm.
and we got rear-ended, so we had to call the police. But I was filtered to the like Wheat Ridge,
Yep.
like non-emergency line. They're like, I was like, I'm on 38th and Sheridan. They're like, well, are you going northbound or southbound? I was like, well, I'm northbound. They're like, well, that's Denver, so we need to transfer you to Denver.
Yep. And
And
I
so
live
it's
at what is it, Lakeside Amusement Park? And that's a little township.
it is, yeah.
And so there's little cops, doing this little small remote area, and they handle that side of the street. So they're constantly giving
Dang.
people speeding tickets on that side of the street.
A friend of mine got a
Wow.
ticket there. She said it was very expensive.
Yes. It's a
And
nice little revenue raise for them because they don't really have any commerce, of any meaningful Molly's, I guess. I think that's in that jurisdiction,
Molly's
which
in
is
Walmart.
good for.
It's a good thing your accident wasn't in the middle of the street, like in a turn lane or
Right?
something.
I was
where-
like, who knows?
are you sitting in the driver's side or are you in the passenger side?
Right?
Because then,
At the end of the day, it didn't really matter because it was an uninsured driver. And it's like, I don't know who's going to pay for it. What police report didn't really matter because we were on the hook for it.
right.
I digress. Well, so then, what do you have any kind of like opinions on the SUTS system? Like, do you, I don't know, it's this thing, it's in place. Do you think it's a good thing? I know Judy's been working really hard on it. And I know she
Sure.
said that you've kind of
Well, Needle was a part of it, her partner. So
right.
he
And come
was-
in,
I got him at the table to make sure he was there to advocate so he could be telling these legislators and cities and counties, like, don't overreach, right? But I also I was sort of like, we've got to get rid of this. I mean, there's just so much non-compliance at the local small business level, and it's too complicated for them to handle, right? So it's just, the money's not going where it needs to go. And I also believe that the biggest taxpayers end up bearing an undue burden, a greater share of the burden than small taxpayers, because everybody's not contributing in as they should be. And I don't think that's a fair level of enforcement either, right?
Right. Yeah. I think from, putting myself in the shoes of our clients, anytime you can remove a barrier to compliance, I think that's a good thing.
Mhm.
So, because a lot of our clients, no matter how large they are, their tax departments are not always very large. I mean, some of them have large tax departments, but these people that work in the tax departments of our larger clients, they're busting their butt to get this right. And so anytime you can make compliance easier, I think that's a good thing. I do think, it remains to be seen whether big cities like Denver are going to sign in and Aurora. I think that's what it's really going to take to have a meaningful uh, removal of barriers, and I know it's just sales and use tax right now. There are a lot of other returns our clients have to file, occupational privilege tax. Sometimes the lodging tax is on a different form, so I wouldn't want to make perfect the enemy of the good, because I think every step towards increased transparency, removal of barriers is a good thing. And I do think if the cities can get some comfort, these are going to go over here to this portal. We're going to get our money. We still have our ability to audit. We still have our ability to be made whole if something goes wrong. I think you're going to see if it goes that way, that more and more cities will be comfortable, especially the smaller ones that don't have their own audit staff or their own compliance staff,
Mhm.
So, but yeah, then if you give meaningful uh, streamlining to companies that maybe haven't been in compliance before, that can move them, nudge them
Right.
towards compliance.
And then, I always think if there were a ton of money and there was no shortage, do you think we'd have any audits? I kind of wonder, right? When things are
Oh, I
good,
do.
do you like, so there'd always be a level of some checking in, right? We're still here. We're not just trusting you to do it right. But I just always wonder, as I watch my career, I feel like I have been really busy when things are dire because enforcement kicks in and then my clients get in trouble and I've got to help them. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And so that ends up being the push pull. When things are good, my clients usually say, all right, I'm going to fix this. Like, we're ready. We can afford to. Well, we want to do the right thing. We just didn't have the resources or the ability to focus on it. Now we will. But I don't know if you feel that way. Then I think, well, what do governance think? Do they think I will go after because I just should? Or do I go after because I want to beat people up, right? Or I need the money. Like, what is it? Desperation? Is it, I mean, what is it, do you think, that creates enforcement at the government level? Because that's arbitrary, just I feel
Right.
like.
I think, and we saw this in the downturn in 08, 09.
Yes, yes, the
You know,
non-resident audits, the 1099 enforcement. I mean, it was crazy, the Nexus questionnaires flying around.
sure. Well, fiscal pressure is clearly a driver on that. If the cities get squeezed, you know, if you have a city that, a lot of their revenue comes from sales and use tax, and the sales and use tax base goes down, they've got to figure out, okay, how do we bring in, here's how they view it. How do we bring into compliance the people who are not complying? Now, do you call that, going after someone, or being mean
Enforcing
to
what should have
someone?
always been done.
Sure. But I think in good times, there's also, let's say, really good financial times. The cities know there's a lot of business being conducted, and maybe some of it's fallen through the cracks. Maybe these big companies, or really, really fast growing companies, we see this a lot with some of our clients who they started up and then all of a sudden their business went crazy, and they didn't have the compliance structure in place because they didn't think about it. And a lot of companies don't even know about use tax. They they hear about sales tax because as a consumer, you go into a store, you pay sales tax, you know what that is. But use tax is almost like, when you say use tax, people think they look at you and say, I know the words you're using are in the English language, but I don't know what that means.
It's so true.
I have used that phrase
And
before. I'm
yeah,
not gonna lie.
yeah,
Full disclosure, everyone.
right. So to explain to them, especially new construction companies or new businesses that are in technology, if they're not selling something, but they're providing a service and they're consuming things to do that, they don't have a lot of awareness around their use tax reporting obligations. And so what we see is businesses, things go really, really great, and then they get big enough to finally realize they have a problem.
Right.
And now, okay, now what? Either the city has come knocking because they found you,
Yes.
because cities, they drive around all the time and they say, oh, that car has a wrap on it, or it has this, or it has that, or they bought something, or someone came to do a service for them, or whatever. They're always looking for new leads for audits.
Okay. Well, Michelle, you've given us a lot of we've talked a lot about the jurisdiction, the city stuff, but that's not who you are today, right? I mean, granted,
Right.
you still do it and you still live in Colorado. Great. But, has there been a case that you've argued that has had the biggest impact on the way you think about tax and the application of the law?
Sure. So, you know when I was a baby lawyer, I was involved in this 2-week long slugfest in Utah on some property tax, some big oil and gas property. And the going through that trial, it drummed home to me, and it's something I remember in every piece of litigation that I do now, that these are compelling issues. And people think about tax as being, oh, tax, when you go to a party and somebody says, what do you do? Oh, I do tax litigation. They're like, yep, bye. So I think I see my friend over there. But frankly, they're emotional. People get emotionally invested on both sides. And the really what underlies for me in every piece of litigation, you got to tell a story. And you think about, well, this is tax. How can there be a story? Well, that's just not true. There's always a story to be told. So you got to get really clear grasp of the facts, and you've got to be able to tell a compelling story about why something is either taxable, or why it has this value or doesn't have this value. So fundamentally, to me, after going through that trial in 2 weeks, and I'll say we lost that trial because we didn't have the best grasp of the facts. And now every time we take a case that is uh, fact critical, obviously setting aside some cases that are just pure questions of law, you still have to have a compelling story. We litigated this case uh, all the way up to the Supreme Court and prevailed, but it's because we were able to set a compelling story about why this entity was created, what business purposes did it have, um, so that it wasn't a sham entity. The courts gave it substance. but you got to put in that extra work to say, I need to understand the facts. I need to understand the why of it. So for me, tax litigation is just like anything else. You've got to present your story. You've got to be the most compelling. So fundamentally for me, I try to remember that in every piece of litigation. You know, it's not just dry tax work.
I was working with your firm on a landscaping client of mine, and the city of Denver was going after two of the biggest landscapers in the state to make a point of whether landscapers are retailers or what are they, right? And Denver decided they're retailers, and they're not thinking they are retailers; they're thinking they're contractors, right? And I'm going to this hearing. One of you, someone who was there before you at your firm was working with me. I can't remember. Rob, I think it was Rob. So I remember driving there, and it's very stressful for my client because this is like $500,000, million. I mean, it's a lot of money at stake for this client. And I'm driving, I'm very agitated because I want to win. I want to prevail. I believe we're right. We believe the city's wrong. But I also sort of had this context of like, well, at least it's not Nazi Germany. I don't know why I went to that example, but there was honestly, the Holocaust and all that. And I thought, well, all right, that puts a framework around it because you can get really caught up in the money at stake, the risk involved, the slight people feel. People are shamed. They don't want to do poorly. They thought they were doing things right. There's just so many things wrapped up in that story, isn't there? I mean, on both sides, honestly, both get wedded to what they believe is the right answer, both sides, and you have to kind of figure out how to get to the middle of that and
Yeah.
get a resolution.
And when you say when you want to kind of pull together a compelling story, is that fact driven? Do you leave the emotion out? Or is there like this perfect marriage of the two of them?
Yeah, I think it has to be. I mean, I would say a little less on the emotion side. There are some cases, especially for small businesses, where the emotion does matter. But um, large businesses, I think the compelling story is mostly factual. Um, but I had the same thing you did, Judy. It's sort of an epiphany when I was in a trial, and I was also in the military at the same time. And on my weekends, I was spending my weekends drafting wills and powers of attorneys for kids that were getting deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. And it just drummed home to me, okay, when I go up and I argue a tax case, nobody's shooting at me. At the end of the day, it's money. Sure, nobody wants to give away money they don't have to. But when you're in the middle of it, it feels so, high stakes and so critical. You have to be mindful that put it in perspective.
Right, it's not life or death. We're not a surgeon operating on someone's brain, but because I do believe it can get to this thing. I mean, I certainly have felt that way over my career because so much is at stake or so much emotion is part of it, and I want to manage that, and then I own it too. I take it in as a helper, as their advocate, right? I'm like, oh, your case is my case. I feel bad for you, even though it's not really my money that's going to be at risk, but it's an interesting issue, and you've got to kind of
Especially for small businesses. I mean, if it's their livelihood, I mean, this is so critical. You miss something, and then all of a sudden you're facing a tax assessment that's going to put you out of business because of some either misunderstanding, or maybe the city has changed their interpretation or their application, or just plain honest error,
right.
you know?
I don't know if
And
you
then
remember,
you're,
there was a really good Vietnam, I think it was called. It was where the Chipotle was at California between 16th and 17th. That place had a line going out the door, this restaurant, amazing Vietnamese food. They got put out of business because they were not paying their sales tax correctly. They probably didn't
what a
understand.
shame. What a
Just
shame.
shut
I
down.
mean,
They were there
yeah,
10 years. I mean,
yeah,
people love that restaurant. I can't even imagine what that family went through. Honestly, I can't
yeah,
even imagine because I'm sure they just
yeah,
didn't know what they didn't know, and the whole business was wiped out. And what were the
right.
repercussions of all that? Because there was a lot.
Yeah, and then you go 3 years down the road, and if you're a business that should have been collecting from your clients, if you're a Vietnamese restaurant, you don't know who your clients are. You can't go out and say, "On that pho noodle bowl we didn't charge you tax on, I'm gonna ask you for 18 cents,"
Yep,
or whatever. Um,
yep. And that puts them out of business. I just remember and even a few years ago, I remember seeing some notices on some doors downtown Denver where which was shut down for sales tax, errors or whatever. I mean, some of the notifications were like $5,000, $2,800 liens. I'm like, that wipes out business. But it can. It really
I'll
can.
tell you, before recreational marijuana became a thing, you know, the dispensaries were working really hard to start collecting sales tax because it was a pathway towards legitimacy. I was working with Denver at the time, and the guy in charge said, "Well, what if they don't pay their sales taxes? Can I seize their inventory and sell it at tax sale?" And I'm thinking that would have been the most amazingly well attended tax sale in Denver's history. I
And then
think,
you can walk out the door and get busted for possession
right,
and then have
right,
to pay the fines for possession.
right, right. Or distribution. The city and
Right?
county of Denver is now distributing marijuana. But
Oh, that would have been kind of funny.
I see your dog.
That
Yeah,
would have
hi,
been an
sweetie.
interesting legal issue you would be thinking about, right?
Right. I told him no. I'm like, even if you had the legal right to do, let's not. Yeah, we're not going to do that.
Well, and then kind of with that, do you see kind of anything in our future of where you think you might be litigating some contentions? If you had a crystal ball, is there kind of like, you know, can you foreshadow anything that may come from a litigation perspective?
Sure. I think in the short term, we don't know yet what COVID's going to mean for our taxing jurisdictions and for our businesses. You know, I hear from property tax clients all the time who they couldn't use their facilities, or it's a landlord whose businesses were not allowed to use the facilities. So they have either, vacancy, or they weren't able to collect rent. So that's going to be a problem. You've got sales tax revenue crazy down in some industries, restaurants, movie theaters, things like that. So I think you might see some short-term COVID. What about occupational privilege tax for those of us who are working remotely? I mean, OPT is usually not high dollar, but if you're a small city and you think, I know those employees used to work in Denver, but we think they're all working somewhere else now. We want that OPT. I don't know if you'll see litigation in those, but if I had a crystal ball, I will tell you the two biggest issues I see are digital products or electronic commerce and tax on electronic commerce. The state's trying to implement a regulation to tax streaming services. We have strong feelings about that, whether that's TPP, tangible personal property, or is it a service? Is it even property? So I think you're going to see a lot of fights over what is TPP and expansion to tax digital goods, electronic goods, things like that. I think that's going to be many, many years of litigation, if I had to guess. I think you're also going to see. Go ahead, Judy.
Well, I was just gonna say you have to find the right client to take it because, like we were talking about earlier, if it's a couple $1,000s, people are just gonna pay it. They're gonna move on. They don't have time to take a case that's gonna cost them $30,000 to $50,000 of fees, 3 years of uncertainty. It needs to be material and it needs to be ongoing. So I think those are the challenges where you gotta get the right taxpayer to take the case forward, or a group of taxpayers. And, honestly, business is, only so motivated to do things like that. So I
Well,
think
especially if they can pass it on to their customer. If you can pass, yeah,
to the Wayfair law that the state enacted, saying, well, we already had a statute, therefore we can have a Wayfair law. And I think a lot of us are like, what? Used to do location and common, and now we're going to destination collection? Whoa, right? But I haven't seen any litigation on that. We've all just capitulated to it. But I would question whether that was a fair reading of the rule, right? But they said, oh, it's fine. We're going to impose that standard. And we haven't seen any litigation on that. But, that's a stretch of saying the language meant one thing and we curtailed it because of Quill. And now it means something else today because of Wayfair. And that's sort of like administrative enforcement, right? And that's what you're going to see with the streaming is an administrative position saying our statute was written this way and therefore we can tax that. And the answer is, really? That's what it meant? Okay, I don't think so. Yeah. Yeah. No,
yeah.
it's
So I think Nexus and marketplace facilitator, Wayfair issues. That's the other bucket I was going to highlight. But I think those are all integrated into digital products because who's selling digital products? It's usually people that are operating from a remote location to you. I mean, you don't go down to a taco cart and buy a streaming service or something, you know what I mean? And so I think all of those are tied together. I think really fundamentally, it's the codes that were established in 1990 or 91 trying to keep up with evolving commerce and the evolving economy and the way we do business anymore. And yes, the bigger vendors, the bigger electronic or marketplaces, they're collecting tax because it's why not? You can pass it on to your customers become inured to it. They'll pay it. It's going to be the smaller. I do believe somebody's going to litigate this issue. Somebody's going to litigate, is a home rule. The home rules are adopting these marketplace ordinances, economic nexus. Is that viable? Can you have a sub-state? Can you have nexus in one sub-state jurisdiction by virtue of establishing nexus in another sub-state jurisdiction? And now if I sell into Denver, do I have to collect Colorado Springs tax? So I think those are hot button issues, but digital goods, e-commerce, marketplace facilitator, I think those are going to be hot button issues going forward.
Well, I don't know, like digital goods, I don't know if we akin that to advertising, but you've probably seen there's been
Yeah.
Maryland trying to impose a digital advertising tax and, Facebook ads. I mean, this SEO, search engine optimization, and monetization of whatever our behavior, we want to target to those people so they will come to us and use our services. And people pay money for that. I mean, we had a client that spent $300,000 a month on Google ads, Google AdWords, I guess, different terms, so that when you Googled it, you came to their platform to say, we can do that for you. There's serious money in that. So what is that? Advertising has never historically been taxable anywhere, except now we're thinking about it because it's a big moneymaker for these.
I know at least one city that is currently taking the position that digital advertising is tangible personal property and taxable as TPP.
Denver is tax newsletters when you belong to an organization because it's a newsletter. You're like, I'm just a member and I get this ancillary newsletter, and you're arguing that the whole bloody membership is taxable. I mean, yeah, I mean, that has been it. Or LinkedIn ads are taxable.
Right.
Like, what? I'm just advertising a position or whatever. That's a taxable service as TPP in Denver. I mean, we have had some fights about that. And what's interesting too is some of our clients spend a lot of money to belong to organizations or have events. I mean, they could spend like $100,000. This isn't like a $20, $350 a year bar association fee, right? It's like something gianter than that. So there's some serious money put towards these organizations, and Denver's like, it's taxable.
Right. I think that's what we're going to see. Anything that has digital is the next wave of, and if you jump the shark, so to speak, and to assume that all of that is tangible personal property, where does that end? What's not TPP?
Right.
And at one point, if you start defining TPP to include anything perceptible to the senses, how is wind or the massage I might go get later, how is that not? Where do you draw the line?
Right. And that's perceptible senses. That's why we get them.
Exactly. Right. Right. So that's what I think is coming down the pipe. But the Colorado home rule cities are definitely working together to try to capture tax on these kinds of things.
To broaden their taxpayer base is what I see.
Absolutely.
Right?
No question about it.
More out-of-state money. That's, to me, like you were saying earlier, it's about getting other people's money, not in-state constituencies. We want to treat our in-state businesses well, or in-city businesses. We want the money from these other companies selling to our citizens.
Yeah, but they forget they're selling to our citizens. So ultimately, who's bearing the burden of this tax? It's clearly the consumer.
Absolutely. In the end, it always is us. Yeah, no.
Always.
And
no
always
question.
comes down to you and me.
Yep.
Well, then as we wrap, I just want to ask if there's anything that you feel we should know that we didn't already talk about. Do you have one final thought to leave us with?
One final thought. I'm going to just take a quote from my partner, Neil Pomerantz. It's not taxable. It's not taxable. So that's the answer to everything. It's not taxable. So.
Oh my God. We're going to have Neil on. We'll let him know. We'll get him on here. Obviously, we want to showcase you as a woman in business and a lawyer and a litigator. And with all the things going on in this world of ours, we just want to really exemplify some women out there. So that's why we wanted to interview you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
I appreciate
Absolutely. And I hate the term
Yeah.
badass, but you're a badass. And we're so lucky to have had you. You know, Judy, another badass woman in the business, doing her thing. Guys, this was a great conversation. You know, Michelle, we really appreciate your insight. This has been the SALTovation podcast. I'm Meredith Smith. Until next time. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended, nor should it be relied upon as legal, tax, accounting, or investment advice. You should consult with a competent professional to discuss specifics of your situation and the applicability of the information presented.